Drop the bag now. The command cracked through the cold night air, sharp enough to slice through the hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves along the empty sidewalk. Red and blue lights pulsed against the brick walls, stretching shadows long and uneven across the pavement as Naomi Carter stood still beneath a flickering street lamp, her breath steady, her hands unmoving around the worn canvas strap resting against her shoulder. The beam from a cruiser's spotlight locked onto her chest, too bright, too deliberate, turning her into a silhouette cut out from the dark. Somewhere behind the glare, a door slammed, footsteps approached, measured and controlled, the heavy rhythm of authority closing in by the second. I said drop it. Another voice followed, tighter this time, edged with impatience that hadn't yet turned into anger but was leaning in that direction. Naomi didn't flinch. The bag shifted slightly against her hip, a subtle movement, barely there, but enough to tighten the air around her. One officer stepped forward, hand hovering near his belt, posture rigid, eyes scanning not just her, but everything about her. The coat, the boots, the stillness, as if stillness itself were suspicious. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. The question hung there, unanswered, stretching the silence thinner and thinner until even the hum of the streetlights felt too loud. Naomi's gaze moved past him for a fraction of a second, not defiant, not afraid. Measured, like she was calculating distance, timing, something invisible to everyone else standing there. "Ma'am, this is your last warning," another officer said from the side, his voice coming through the crackle of a shoulder radio that echoed softly with dispatch chatter. "We received a report. Possible K-9 unit theft in the area. You match the description." The words landed heavier than the lights, heavier than the presence of 3 uniforms closing in around her, forming a loose circle that tightened with every second she didn't move. Naomi exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that didn't signal surrender, just control. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice low, even, cutting through the tension without raising itself. For a moment, no one responded. Then a short, humorless scoff came from the officer closest to her. "Yeah? And why's that?" he asked, taking another step forward, boots scraping softly against the concrete. The distance between them shrank to less than 6 feet. Now, close enough for him to see the calm in her eyes, close enough for her to hear the faint shift of leather as his stance adjusted. The bag moved again, a slight tremor, subtle but unmistakable this time, and every officer saw it. Hands tightened, shoulders squared. The air changed. Naomi's fingers loosened just slightly on the strap, not dropping it, not lifting it, just enough to show she wasn't gripping it out of fear. The streetlight above her buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the scene, catching the edge of something stitched into the side of the bag, though no one had stepped close enough to read it yet. Somewhere down the block, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before disappearing, leaving only the flashing red and blue to paint everything in restless motion. On the ground. "Now," the first officer said again, quieter this time, more controlled, like he believed control alone would end this. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, listening, not to them, but to something else, something distant, something approaching that hadn't yet entered their awareness. The silence stretched again, thicker now, pressing in from all sides. And then, almost imperceptible, she gave the smallest signal, a breath, a shift, a decision forming in stillness. The officer's radio crackled again, louder this time, the static slicing through the silence like a blade that refused to settle. But Naomi did not move, not even when one of the men shifted closer and the beam of his flashlight climbed from her boots to her face, searching for something that was not there, fear, hesitation, guilt, anything that would confirm the version of her they had already decided on before stepping out of their cars. She stood at 5 feet 7 inches, shoulders relaxed beneath a worn dark coat that had seen too many late nights and too many quiet walks home, the fabric catching the light in dull, uneven patches as if it carried its own history stitched into every thread. Her hands were visible, just like they asked, fingers loose, palms open, but the bag remained where it was, hanging at her side, not hidden, not presented, simply there, existing in a way that seemed to irritate them more with every passing second. "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate," the first officer said, his voice lower now, controlled in that practiced way that suggested patience was something he performed rather than felt. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to his badge, then back to his face, memorizing, not challenging, just observing, the way someone does when they have learned that every detail might matter later. "I am cooperating," she replied, her tone steady, carrying just enough weight to be heard without pushing back. The officer hesitated, not because he believed her, but because something about the way she said it did not match the situation he expected to be in. Behind him, another officer circled slightly, adjusting his position to close the angle, boots scraping softly against the pavement as he glanced at the bag again, then at her, then back at the bag, as if it might reveal its contents just from being watched hard enough. "We got a call," he said, slower this time, like repeating it would make it more real. "Military dogs missing from a nearby transport. That is serious. That is not something we ignore." Naomi nodded once, a small movement, almost respectful, but it did not carry agreement, only acknowledgement. "I understand," she said quietly. The wind picked up for a moment, tugging at the edge of her coat, brushing loose strands of hair across her cheek, and in that brief shift of air, a faint sound came from the bag again. Not loud, not aggressive, just a low presence, controlled, contained, alive. Every officer heard it. Shoulders tightened. One of them took a half step back without realizing it, his weight shifting instinctively before his pride pulled him forward again. "That is it," the first officer said, more certain now, as if the sound had given him the confirmation he needed. "Put it down slowly." Naomi's grip adjusted slightly, not defensive, not reluctant, just deliberate, and for the first time, the edge of a stitched patch caught the light fully, a small rectangle of fabric sewn near the seam of the bag, but none of them stepped close enough to read it. Not yet, not while tension held them in place like invisible lines drawn across the ground. Naomi's breathing remained even, in through her nose, out through her mouth, steady in a way that did not belong in a moment like this, and that was what unsettled them more than anything else, not the bag, not the sound, but her calm, the kind that did not ask for permission and did not seek approval. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," one officer muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough to fill the space between them. Naomi tilted her head slightly again, listening, not to him, not to the radio, but to something beyond the circle of flashing lights, something still distant but closing in, measured, precise, familiar. The city around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual rhythm of late-night traffic fading into the background, leaving only the pulse of the cruisers and the quiet tension of a moment stretched to its limit. Naomi's eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, not with relief, but with recognition, as if something she had been waiting for was finally within range. "You really should step back," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle now, and that was the moment the uncertainty began to shift, subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the air changing before a storm, not louder, not brighter, just different in a way none of them could yet explain. The first sound did not come from the bag. It came from beyond the reach of the flashing lights, low and distant at first, like a vibration carried through the pavement rather than the air, subtle enough that only Naomi reacted to it, her eyes shifting just slightly to the far end of the street, where darkness still held its shape untouched by red and blue. One of the officers frowned, glancing over his shoulder as if he felt it too, but could not place it, his grip tightening not out of certainty, but out of something less comfortable, something closer to doubt. "Stay focused," the lead officer said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, as he stepped forward again, closing the space to just a few feet, the beam of his flashlight steady now, fixed on the bag as though it were the center of everything. Naomi did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, grounded in a way that made the tension around her feel misplaced, like a scene that had been rehearsed wrong. "Last chance," the officer said, each word measured, deliberate. Naomi's lips parted slightly, not to argue, not to resist, but to speak something that carried no urgency at all. "They are already here," she said. The words landed softly, but they shifted the air immediately. One officer turned sharply, scanning the empty street behind them, but it was no longer empty. From the edge of the block, just beyond the reach of the cruiser lights, two shapes emerged, moving with controlled precision, not fast, Not slow, just certain, their silhouettes cutting through the darkness with a presence that did not need sound to be felt. The faint click of claws against pavement followed, rhythmic and steady, each step deliberate, each movement aligned with something trained, something disciplined far beyond instinct. "What is that?" one officer muttered, his voice dropping without permission, as if speaking louder might change what he was seeing. The shapes moved closer, and the light caught them piece by piece, first the outline of their shoulders, then the defined structure of their stance, then the unmistakable form of two large working dogs, their posture alert, but not aggressive, their attention fixed not on the officers, but on Naomi. The lead officer instinctively stepped back half a pace, the shift small but undeniable, his authority faltering just enough to be seen. "Ma'am, call them off," he said quickly, but there was a crack in his tone now, a break in the certainty that had filled his voice before. Naomi did not move toward the dogs. She did not raise a hand. She simply remained where she was, and as the dogs reached her, they slowed in perfect unison, stopping just at her sides, one on each flank, forming a quiet barrier that was not threatening, but absolute. They did not bark. They did not lunge. They stood, still, watching, waiting. Their ears were forward, their bodies aligned with hers as if they had been placed there with intention rather than arrival. The officers froze, not because they were told to, but because something in the moment demanded it. The beam of the flashlight wavered slightly, catching a patch on one of the dog's harnesses, the stitching clear now under the light, bold letters that no one could ignore once seen. The lead officer leaned forward just enough to read it, and when he did, the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. His shoulders lowered a fraction. His jaw tightened, then released. "Military," he said under his breath, the word barely audible, but heavy enough to change everything. Naomi finally moved. Not stepping away, not stepping forward, just turning her head slightly toward the dogs, her presence aligning with theirs in a way that made the entire scene feel suddenly smaller, quieter, like the tension had nowhere left to go. The radio crackled again, but no one reached for it. No one spoke. For the first time since the lights had come on, the officers were no longer leading the moment. They were inside it, reacting to it, trying to understand it as it unfolded in front of them, one controlled breath at a time. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if once spoken it refused to settle back into silence, and the officers felt it, that quiet shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything anyway, the kind that turns certainty into hesitation without asking permission. The lead officer straightened slightly, but the movement lacked the sharp authority he carried before, replaced now with something more careful, more measured, like he was stepping onto ground he had not expected to find beneath him. His flashlight lowered just a fraction, no longer fixed on the bag, no longer treating it as the center of the threat, because the scene had moved beyond that now. The dogs did not move. They remained exactly where they were, flanking Naomi with a stillness that was not passive, not idle, but trained, intentional, controlled down to the smallest shift of muscle. Their presence did not escalate the moment. It contained it, like a boundary drawn without a line. One of the officers swallowed quietly, his gaze moving from the harness to Naomi, then back again, trying to reconcile the two, trying to fit her into the version of events he had built just minutes ago, and failing to do so. "Ma'am," the lead officer said again. But this time the word carried weight in a different direction, no longer a command, no longer a warning, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if he had just realized he was speaking to someone he did not fully understand. Naomi's eyes met his, calm as before, unchanged, but now that calm carried something else with it, something that had not needed to be shown until now. She adjusted the strap of the bag slowly, deliberately, not to hide it, not to present it, just to settle it more comfortably against her side. And in that small movement the light caught the patch clearly for the first time, bold letters stitched in clean lines that left no room for misreading. The officer's eyes dropped to it, then lifted again, and the pause that followed was longer than any silence before it. "You should have led with that," one of the other officers muttered, but there was no edge to his voice now, only the quiet release of tension that had nowhere else to go. Naomi did not respond right away. The city seemed to return in fragments, the distant hum of a car engine, The faint buzz of the streetlight above, the soft shift of fabric as someone adjusted their stance, all the small sounds that had been pushed out by tension now slipping back into place. "I did not need to," she said finally, her voice even, not defensive, not sharp, just true in a way that made explanation unnecessary. The lead officer exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding without realizing it, and stepped back a full pace this time, creating space where there had been none. His hand moved away from his belt, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just naturally, as if it no longer belonged there. "We had a report," he said again, but the repetition sounded different now, less like justification, more like reflection. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the words without absorbing the weight of them. "I know," she replied. The dogs shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting their stance in perfect synchronization, their attention still fixed, their presence still absolute, but no longer the center of concern, because the understanding had already begun to take shape. The officer glanced once more at the harness, then at Naomi, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough to be felt, a quiet recognition that the moment had never been what he thought it was. The radio crackled again, louder this time, a voice asking for status, for confirmation, for something that would bring clarity back to a situation that no longer fit into simple categories. He reached for it, then paused, looking at Naomi one more time, as if waiting for something, not permission, but understanding. Naomi gave the smallest nod, and it was enough. The officer lifted the radio, his voice steady but no longer rigid. "Situation under control," he said, and for the first time since the lights had come on, it was true in a way none of them had expected. The radio settled back into silence after the transmission, but the quiet that followed was no longer tense, no longer sharp at the edges. It was something heavier, something reflective, as if the moment itself had paused to reconsider what it had almost become. The lead officer lowered his hand slowly, the device still in his grip, his eyes no longer scanning for threats, but searching for understanding, tracing the lines of a situation that had unfolded too quickly and revealed too much all at once. Naomi remained where she was, steady as before, the soft glow of the streetlight outlining her figure and the two dogs beside her, their presence no longer a mystery, but not entirely explained either, something that demanded respect without asking for it. One of the officers shifted his weight, glancing down at the pavement, then back up at Naomi, as if trying to find the right place to rest his attention without overstepping again. "We did not mean to escalate things," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and the words hung in the air like an offering that did not quite know where to land. Naomi's gaze softened just slightly, not with forgiveness, not with approval, but with recognition of the moment as it was, imperfect, human, unfolding. "You responded to what you were told," she said, her tone even, giving the words back to them without adding weight or judgment. The lead officer nodded once, slowly, as if the simplicity of her response carried more weight than anything else she could have said. He glanced again at the harness, then at the bag, then finally back at her, and the question that followed came without force, without assumption. "Those dogs, they are yours." Naomi looked down briefly, her hand brushing lightly against the side of the nearest dog, not a command, not a signal, just a quiet acknowledgement, and the dog responded with the smallest shift of posture, a subtle lean that spoke of trust built over time rather than given freely. "They are assigned to me," she said. The distinction was small, but it landed differently, precise, intentional, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Another officer let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as the pieces began to settle into place, the earlier report reshaping itself in his mind, no longer a clear threat, but a misread fragment of a larger truth. "We were told they were missing," he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi nodded again, this time with a hint of something deeper behind it, not frustration, not anger, but a quiet awareness of how easily information can shift when passed from one voice to another. "They were being relocated," she replied. "Temporary transfer. Different unit. Different chain of command." The lead officer's jaw tightened briefly, not in resistance, but in recognition of how quickly assumptions had filled the gaps left by incomplete information. He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up at her, meeting her eyes fully for the first time without the filter of suspicion. "We should have verified before approaching like that," he said, the admission coming out steady, unforced, carrying a weight that did not need to be emphasized. Naomi held his gaze for a second, then gave a small nod, accepting the acknowledgement without expanding on it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. The dogs remained still, their presence unchanged, but the energy around them had shifted entirely, no longer a line of defense, but a quiet reminder of what discipline looks like when it is not driven by fear. A car passed at the far end of the street, its headlights briefly washing over the scene before fading into the distance. And for a moment, everything felt almost ordinary again, as if the intensity of the last few minutes had been folded neatly into the night. The officer cleared his throat softly, adjusting his stance, no longer closing space, no longer holding it either, just standing in it. "You are free to go," he said, and this time the words carried no authority, only respect. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the bag settling more comfortably against her side, and the dogs mirrored her movement with quiet precision, ready without being told. She took one step forward, then another, passing through the space that had once been blocked, and as she did, none of the officers moved to stop her, none of them spoke, they simply watched, not out of suspicion, but out of something closer. To understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but stays long after the moment has passed. Naomi's footsteps softened as she moved past the edge of the flashing lights, each step steady, unhurried, the kind of pace that did not carry urgency because it did not need to, and behind her the presence of the officers faded not in distance, but in weight, their authority no longer pressing against her back the way it had moments ago. The dogs stayed aligned at her sides, their movement precise, quiet, their paws landing in a rhythm that matched her breathing more than the pavement, as if they were tuned to her rather than the world around them. The street stretched ahead, dimly lit, the glow of distant lamps forming small islands of light along the sidewalk, and for a moment everything felt suspended, like the night itself had paused to let the tension drain out slowly instead of snapping it away. Naomi's hand brushed lightly against the nearest harness again, fingers tracing the edge of the fabric where the stitching met the worn nylon, grounding herself in something familiar, something earned. She did not look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind her that required her attention. The moment had already said what it needed to say. A faint breeze moved through the street, lifting the edges of her coat, carrying with it the distant hum of a passing car and the soft echo of voices fading behind her, quieter now, less defined, as if even sound itself respected the distance she was creating. The dogs adjusted slightly as they walked, one half step ahead, one half step behind, maintaining a formation that was not rigid but intentional, a quiet choreography shaped by hours, days, years of training that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with trust. Naomi's breathing remained even, but there was a subtle shift in it now, a release, not dramatic, not visible to anyone watching, but real, the kind that comes after a moment where control had to be held tightly and is finally allowed to loosen. The streetlight ahead flickered once, then steadied, casting a warm, muted glow over the sidewalk as she stepped into it, her shadow stretching long behind her before dissolving into the darker pavement. For a second, the world felt smaller, quieter, contained within that circle of light, and she paused, just briefly, not stopping completely, just slowing enough for the moment to settle fully. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, not in exhaustion, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, as if she were marking the moment internally, placing it somewhere it would not be forgotten, but would not need to be carried either. The dogs remained still when she slowed, their bodies adjusting without command, their attention still anchored to her presence, not scanning, not reacting, simply existing with her in that shared space. Naomi opened her eyes again and continued forward, the rhythm returning naturally, each step measured, consistent, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not seek recognition. Behind her, the flashing lights still painted the buildings in red and blue, but the colors no longer reached her, no longer defined the scene she was in. Ahead, the street opened into quiet darkness, the kind that was not empty but peaceful, where the only sounds were her footsteps and the soft, synchronized movement of the dogs beside her. The night air felt cooler now, brushing against her skin with a clarity that had been hidden before, and with each step, the tension of the earlier moment dissolved further, not erased, but transformed into something quieter, something that settled beneath the surface instead of pressing against it. Naomi adjusted the strap of the bag once more, the motion small, almost habitual, and the dogs mirrored her pace again, their presence constant, unwavering, not as protection, not as a show of force, but as something deeper, something built over time that did not need to be explained to be understood. The street stretched on, and she walked into it without hesitation, carrying nothing more than what she already was, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than anything that had been said. Halfway down the block, Naomi slowed again, not because she needed to, but because something behind her had not fully let go, a presence that lingered even as distance grew, and this time she did glance back, just once, over her shoulder, her eyes cutting through the dim light to where the cruisers still idled with their engines low and steady. The officers had not moved much, but their posture had changed, no longer forming a barrier, no longer holding a line. They stood apart now, separated by more than just space, each of them carrying a different version of what had just happened. The lead officer remained closest to where she had been stopped, his silhouette framed by the fading strobe of red and blue, his radio still in his hand, though he was no longer speaking into it. He was watching her, not in suspicion, not in authority, but in a way that suggested he was trying to understand something that did not fit neatly into what he had been trained to expect. Naomi held that glance for only a second before turning forward again, but it was enough for him to step forward slightly, not closing the distance, just acknowledging it. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Not loud, but clear, the kind of tone that asked rather than demanded. Naomi stopped. The dogs stopped with her, their bodies aligning instantly, their attention shifting back without tension, simply following her lead. She did not turn right away, letting the silence settle again, letting him decide what he was going to say next without interruption. Footsteps approached, slower now, careful, each one measured as if the ground itself required a different kind of respect than it had before. When Naomi finally turned, the officer was still several feet away, far enough to keep space, close enough to be heard without raising his voice. Up close, the details were clearer, the lines of his face less rigid, the set of his shoulders no longer squared in confrontation, but relaxed in a way that looked unfamiliar on him. He glanced briefly at the dogs, then back to her, not avoiding them, not staring either, just acknowledging their presence as part of her, not separate from it. "You said they were assigned to you," he began, his words slower now, deliberate, as if he understood that rushing them would undo something important. Naomi nodded once, waiting, her posture unchanged, her expression calm but attentive. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued, "I should have asked that before." The admission landed differently this time, not as an apology, not as a defense, but as recognition, simple and direct. Naomi's gaze softened just slightly, not because the words fixed anything, but because they mattered in a way that did not need to be explained. "Most people do not," she replied. The officer exhaled quietly, a breath that seemed to carry more than just the moment, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that looked like understanding, not complete, not perfect, but real enough to shift the space between them. He glanced down briefly, then back up, as if choosing his next words carefully, aware now that they would carry weight whether he intended them to or not. "You were not what we expected," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a statement that revealed more about his expectation than about her. Naomi held his gaze, steady, and for a moment the night seemed to narrow around them, the distant sounds fading again, the streetlight above casting a quiet glow that softened the edges of everything. "That is the problem," she said, her voice calm, not sharp, not raised, but firm in a way that did not invite argument. The officer did not respond right away. He stood there, absorbing the words, letting them settle, and in that silence, something shifted again, smaller this time, more internal, but just as real. He nodded once, slowly, not as agreement, not as submission, but as acknowledgement, the kind that comes when a truth is recognized even if it is not fully understood yet. The dogs remained still, their presence unchanged, but the space around them felt different now, no longer defined by tension or misunderstanding, but by something quieter, something that lingered beneath the surface. Naomi turned again without another word, her movement smooth, unforced, and the dogs followed instantly, their steps falling back into rhythm with hers. Behind her, the officer remained where he was, watching her go, not with authority, not with suspicion, but with a silence that held more weight than anything he had said before, as if the moment had given him something he could not easily set down. Naomi's footsteps carried her farther into the quiet stretch of the street, the glow of the patrol lights now reduced to a distant pulse behind her, barely touching the edges of the world she had stepped into, and with every yard she moved forward, the weight of the moment shifted again, not disappearing, but settling into something quieter, something that no longer demanded attention but refused to be forgotten. The dogs moved with her in perfect rhythm, their presence unchanged, steady, grounded, their focus not on what had passed but on what remained, the simple act of walking beside her through a night that had returned to its natural stillness. The air felt cooler now, brushing against her skin with a clarity that came after tension had broken, and the faint scent of asphalt and distant rain lingered just enough to anchor the moment in something real. Behind her, the officers remained where they were, but the lead officer had not turned away. He stood at the edge of the fading light, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting at his sides, watching as the distance between them grew, not trying to close it, not calling out again, simply observing in a way that felt different from before, less like control and more like reflection. He shifted his weight slowly, the movement subtle, and glanced down at the ground where Naomi had stood just minutes ago, as if trying to trace the moment back to where it had begun, to understand how something so routine had unfolded into something he could not easily explain. One of the other officers approached him, speaking quietly, their words too soft to carry, but the tone was different now, stripped of urgency, carrying a kind of unease that came from recognizing a mistake that had not resulted in harm but had still left its mark. The lead officer nodded once, his gaze still fixed ahead, then finally reached for his radio again, lifting it slowly, not with the same certainty as before, but with a kind of care that suggested he understood the weight of what he was about to say. "Dispatch," he began, his voice steady but softer. "The report on the K-9 unit appears to be a miscommunication. Subject identified. No threat. Repeat, no threat." The words moved through the air and disappeared into static, but their meaning stayed, settling into the space around him in a way that could not be undone. Naomi did not hear the full transmission, not clearly, but she heard enough, the tone, the shift, the absence of tension, and she did not slow down, did not turn back, because there was nothing left that required her presence there. She adjusted the strap of her bag again, the motion small, habitual, and one of the dogs lifted its head slightly, ears forward, sensing the subtle change, then relaxed again, matching her pace without question. The street ahead remained open, quiet, lit only by scattered lamps that hummed faintly overhead, each one casting a circle of light that she passed through without hesitation, her shadows stretching and disappearing with each step. For a moment, she thought about how easily things could have unfolded differently, how quickly assumptions can turn into actions, how thin the line can be between control and misunderstanding. But the thought did not linger. It passed through her like the breeze, acknowledged and released. What remained was something steadier, something rooted deeper than the moment itself, the quiet knowledge of who she was, of what she carried, not just in the bag at her side, but in the way she moved, the way she stood, the way she chose not to react when reaction would have been easier. Behind her, the patrol lights dimmed as one of the cruisers powered down, the red and blue fading into darkness, leaving the street to its natural colors again, softer, more honest, and the lead officer finally turned away, his gaze dropping for a brief second before lifting again toward his partners, the weight of the moment settling into him in a way that would not leave quickly. Naomi continued forward, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, the dogs beside her moving as one. And as the distance grew, The night closed gently around her, not swallowing her, but holding her in a quiet that felt earned, a silence that did not need to be broken because it already said everything that mattered. The street stretched long and quiet ahead of Naomi, the last traces of flashing lights now gone completely, replaced by a steady darkness softened only by the occasional street lamp humming overhead. And with each step she took, the world behind her seemed to fold inward, not erased, but settled into something distant, something that no longer reached her. Her pace never changed, not faster, not slower, just consistent, grounded, the rhythm of her footsteps blending seamlessly with the soft, synchronized movement of the dogs at her sides, their presence unwavering, their focus aligned with hers in a way that did not need to be spoken. The night air moved gently around them, cool and clean, carrying only the faintest sounds of the city far away, a car passing somewhere. Unseen, a door closing in the distance, the quiet pulse of life continuing without interruption. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag once more, the motion small, almost automatic, and one of the dogs lifted its head slightly in response, then settled again, matching her stride perfectly, as if every step they took had already been decided long before this moment ever began. The pavement beneath her feet felt steady, familiar, each inch of it grounded in something real, something that did not shift with assumptions or voices or flashing lights. She did not look back again. There was no need. The moment behind her had already finished speaking, and whatever it left behind was not hers to carry. Ahead, the street opened into a wider stretch, the sidewalk curving gently beneath a row of taller lamps that cast a warmer light, soft and even, and as she stepped into it, her shadow formed once more beside her, no longer stretched or distorted, just present, moving with her instead of against her. The dogs remained close, one on each side, their bodies relaxed now, but still precise, their training not something they turned on or off, but something that lived in every movement, every pause, every breath. Naomi's shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in a quiet release, the kind that comes when a moment passes without taking anything from you that you cannot reclaim. She inhaled slowly, the air filling her lungs with a calm that had been there all along, just waiting for space to return. Somewhere far behind her, the city continued, conversations resumed, radios spoke, engines idled, but none of it reached her now. What remained was the simple sound of her footsteps and the soft, measured presence of the dogs beside her, a rhythm that carried forward without hesitation. She reached the end of the block and turned the corner, disappearing from the line of sight that had once held her, and as she did, the light shifted again, the street behind her fading completely into stillness. No voices followed. No commands echoed. Only the quiet remained, stretched across the pavement like something earned, something undeniable. Naomi walked on, her figure gradually blending into the calm of the night, her presence steady, unbroken, leaving behind nothing but a silence that spoke louder than anything that had been said, a silence that held its ground long after she was gone.